welcome to Postpartum in the Raw. Today we have guest Grace Lilywhite. Welcome, Grace. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm super excited to have you on and to hear about your postpartum story and the work that you're doing to support postpartum moms. So, before we get started, I do like to begin by asking, before you were pregnant and then went through your subsequent postpartum experience, did you have any idea of what to expect? And if you did, how was that different than what you actually experienced postpartum?
I wish I could remember better the level of my cluelessness. I think so. I trained as a pre and postnatal Pilates teacher about 3 years before I got pregnant. And so I'd been working not exclusively with pre and postnatal women, but the majority of my work was with pre and postnatal women for about 3 years. So I felt like I knew quite a lot about babies, maybe not babies actually, but about women postnatally and in pregnancy. But somehow along the line, I just didn't know very much. I knew how to exercise postnatally, but I didn't. I just didn't really think about it. I think too much. I think that I thought that motherhood just came to you, and that you just kind of knew that it all just happened quite easily and naturally. And I think that my oldest daughter is 10 in September. So I'm starting to feel like quite an old mum. And I was just thinking, when I was sort of thinking about today, that I think things have changed quite a lot in those 10 years, in terms of, like, I wasn't on Instagram when my daughter was born. There was a lot less sort of general talk, I think, about this kind of thing than, there weren't really podcasts and things like that. It was life was a bit different, and I think I just didn't really worry about the postnatal bit. I was very focused on the birth. I was, like, quite obsessed with how I wanted my birth to go. And I think that also is maybe part of what I found really difficult, is that my birth didn't go how I planned it, how I wanted it to go. And so therefore I was sort of also coming to terms with that in the postnatal period, and sort of having a lot of emotion around my birth experience, which definitely fed into my postnatal experience as well.
So, the disappointment that took place because of your birth and the changes in the outcomes, did that leave you? Did that lead you into postpartum depression or postpartum anxiety? Like, what happened?
Yeah,
What happened there?
I was never diagnosed with anything, but I've kind of self-diagnosed myself with hindsight with postpartum anxiety, because I was super anxious. Like, I was, I thought that my baby hated me. I really remember being up in the middle of the night and thinking, and it makes me feel emotional now. Like, she definitely doesn't hate me now. But I remember being up in the middle of the night and her crying, and me just thinking, she just hates me. Like, she blames me for the fact that her, she didn't have. I wanted to have a home birth. I wanted to have this kind of idyllic entry into the world, and my birth actually was really not it wasn't a terrible birth, but it was just not what I wanted. And I really felt like I'd let her down, and the kind of thing that, when, if someone had said all the things that I said to myself to me, I would have said, that's crazy, it's ridiculous to think like that, of course you did what you thought was the right thing. And but I was so hard on myself about it. I had no kind of self-compassion around it all. I was really, like, I felt like I'd failed. I felt like I'd failed her. And I think, and I think that kind of led to me just creating this story about me not being good enough as a mum. It all just kind of, but it's really odd, because I would say that probably most people who knew me at that point, I don't think many people would have said that I was not coping. When I look back on it, I really feel like I wasn't. So yeah, it's interesting. I would.
Was that an added pressure for you that you kind of knew that people had a certain perspective of how you were doing, and then knowing on the inside that that's not really what was happening? Did you have that level of awareness in the moment?
I don't know. I think I thought I was okay. I know that might sound really weird based on everything that I've just said, but I think I didn't know how bad the thoughts I was having was. If I know
Mhm.
that might sound a bit odd, but I think I just felt like, of course I feel like this because I didn't, you know, I didn't do what I wanted. It didn't go how I wanted. She didn't have the start that I wanted her to have. And I think, and I know definitely, and in some ways, I sort of feel like it was meant to be because I think it kind of made me the mum that I am in terms of that I got really into sort of gentle parenting, and I was, I breastfed and I co-slept and I did a lot of things that I'd never planned to do, but I just sort of I just wanted to be near her. Like I wanted to, and I felt like I wanted to kind of make up for the things that I hadn't done. And which again sounds is not a particularly healthy way of doing it, I think. But I also am quite glad that I did do all those things. And I think maybe if I'd have had the birth that I wanted, I might have approached it all differently. Um, so yeah, I don't know. Who knows?
No, I love that though, because it's true. Like our experiences, they propel us on these pathways, and sometimes it's something that we didn't plan at all. And I do think so often our postpartum seasons can be very transformative in terms of impacting who we become as parents and kind of setting us on a certain path. I've heard a ton of people talk about, and even in my personal experience, choosing a holistic lifestyle, or like you said, leaning into gentle parenting. And even though it's a coping mechanism of sort, it's still something that leads us down ultimately a path that impacts how we parent. Um, you mentioned the postpartum anxiety. Was there something else that took place postpartum physically that impacted your recovery?
So I was diagnosed with a prolapse when my daughter was about 4 or 5 months old. I and it's one of those weird things how because I'd worked with pre and postnatal women, I'd worked with quite a lot of people with prolapses, and the one thing that I just always thought was, I really don't want to get a prolapse. I really don't. I really hope I don't. That doesn't happen to me. But then I had I had an epidural and I had quite a long pushing stage, and my baby was also she was quite big, so I'd been carrying that weight around. I'm also hypermobile, which increases your likelihood of prolapse issues. So I had kind of a
Wow.
cocktail of, reasons that I would be more likely to have a prolapse. And then also, I think like I didn't take very good care of myself initially postnatally. I hadn't prepared for it really. I didn't really realize how much support I would need. And I also, like little things, like I've got, there's a photo of me. I think my baby was about 3 days old. And I remember my husband saying, like, come on, we need to go for a walk. We've been in the house and bearing in mind, I didn't come home from the hospital till she was like probably like the end of her first day. I was literally like, had one day at home, and then he was like, right, come on, let's get out. And because that's how we always lived, we were always, we were quite young, we were busy, we lived in central London, like, we had that kind of lifestyle of just rushing around all the time. And so it was quite normal to me that he was saying it. And I remember saying, oh, I don't really know if I feel like going out, and but not really knowing like you don't need to go out. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
absolutely fine to stay in the house. And there's this photo of me walking. I think we literally walked like 10 minutes around the block. Um, but again, like knowing what I know now about pelvic floor health, like it was obviously way too much for my pelvic floor to be up at that. And I can remember, like, this is a bit too much information maybe for some people, but I can remember standing up at points and like feeling like everything was going to fall out, kind of thing. But not just getting into bed, like, still having the visitors and, entertaining people um, and and then my daughter, again, she was a very clingy baby. She never wanted to be put down. I basically, when I kind of, initially I would just stay at home and hold her, but then, again, like I was quite a busy person, and um, so then after however long of that, I was just like, I need to be up and about, and so I used to put her in a sling, and I just used to walk for miles and miles and miles with her in the sling. And I'm pretty sure that that was kind of the final straw for my pelvic floor. I think it was not long after that I started carrying her in the sling, like pretty much 24 hours a day, um, that I was then diagnosed with a prolapse. And I think it didn't like really badly affect me. Like I was lucky that because I knew about exercise, and I had been doing Pilates since I was quite early postnatal, and very safe, very um, prolapse friendly exercise. So I was lucky that I didn't have loads of symptoms. I didn't have loads of problems with it. But I think one of the things with prolapse is that it's just a bit like I was saying about how when I was pregnant, I really couldn't stand the idea of it. I think it's just mentally, when you get told that that's what's going on in your body, it just feels, it's quite an overwhelming feeling of like, what does this mean? How am I going to be okay in the future? Am I going to need to have surgery at some point? What, there's just so many, and knowing that I wanted to have more children as well, it was a kind of, how does that affect what happens in the future? So I was definitely quite overwhelmed with that as well.
Wow. So having all this knowledge, right? You teach Pilates, you're familiar, maybe even you had a level of awareness of what was happening in your body. What
Yeah.
was actually the breaking point that took you in to the specialist to even get diagnosed? Because I think a lot of folks listening, if they're experiencing certain symptoms, they may not know, oh, at this point I need to say something, or I need to go in for a visit. So what was the point for you that actually took you into even getting to the point of diagnosis? Because I think so many of us walk around with pelvic floor traumas and issues, and we're having painful sex, or we're having accidents on ourselves and things like that. And some folks just never go get it checked out. So what was that moment for you?
Yeah, so again, I was really lucky that I was aware enough of my pelvic floor that I didn't have a lot of symptoms, but I knew something wasn't quite right. And it was just a feeling of heaviness, and it feels a little when you're symptomatic, it feels a little bit like, or like for me, like if you've got a tampon in, but it's not in properly, and there's just like a feeling of sort of a bit of discomfort and heaviness in around the vagina. And that's how it was for me. And it was, like I say, it was quite subtle. Like it didn't feel like a massive problem. I think probably if I hadn't known what I know, I probably wouldn't have ever gone and got it, or maybe not ever, but I don't think I would have got it diagnosed at that point. But I was quite aware of the fact that how much your pelvic floor can be impacted. And so I went sort of, I kind of preempted it, I guess, and went before a lot of people probably would have gone.
Wow. And so looking back, because you talked about the sling, and now that you're saying it, I'm thinking, the sling, depending of if it's a front carry, I'm sure that it was giving you the same kind of heaviness and feeling of pregnancy, and that's probably like what you said tipped you over the edge. For someone listening that may not know as much as you or I about pelvic floor health, what are some key things that you found in your time supporting moms with these issues? What are some key indicators that they should be looking out for around pelvic floor health?
So leaking is the really big one that is kind of, I was chatting to someone today actually who was saying how we kind of normalize it in society, and it's, people like laugh about it and like joke, oh, I just, need to put 10 of ladies in and things like that. But if you're leaking at all, it's not just something that you should accept. And I think you said earlier about the fact that your postnatal period can really sort of impact what happens through the rest of your life. And I really think that in terms of your pelvic floor health, that it's, I think often postnatally, we kind of just accept things, and even potentially go to GPs, or here we call doctors. But in the UK, what would happen? You might be leaking, go and see your GP, and there's lots of GPs that then say, "Oh, well, you're only 3 months postnatal; it's normal. You don't worry about it." Or even, "Oh, well, you're 40. Women over 40 often leak. Don't worry about it." It really is something that you shouldn't put up with. You need to push to get support for it, because um, again, I think in America they're called pelvic floor PTs. Here we call it women's health physios. But there is so much support available, and if you can go and get checked and get your pelvic floor looked at, that often you can really, again, like, preempt issues. Like, what happens a lot is that people leave it so late that by the time they actually get checked, they do need surgery, or it's a really, really long process to recover. But actually, if you can get on top of it ahead of time, and the moment you feel like something's not quite right, look at that. And when you're exercising, for example, the leaking, but also like a feeling of heaviness. I had a client once who did a lot of boot camp classes, and she would do things like star jumps. And she actually didn't come to me about her pelvic floor. She came to me about back pain. But there's a really big correlation between pelvic floor health and back pain. And so we were working together, and we ended up talking about her pelvic floor, and then she realized that once she became much more aware of her pelvic floor, she was then going to her boot camp classes and being like, she didn't leak when she did things like star jumps, but she realized, actually, this doesn't feel good. I don't feel like I should be doing this. But she just never tuned into it, because we're kind of trained to ignore things like that, I guess, and kind of told, just get on with it. Don't worry about it. But you really do set yourself up for a much better journey in terms of your pelvic floor. And when a lot of, say if women are having babies in their 30s, they may not even have any issues, but then they get to their 50s and hormones start to change. And when your hormone levels change, then often it's the pelvic floor that's one of the signs that musculoskeletally you are not functioning in quite the same way. So it's really, I think it's really important that everyone postnatally just has an awareness of what's going on in their pelvic floor. So it's not even necessarily about massive symptoms. It's about thinking about it, and just thinking, like, if you go for a run, if you don't feel anything and it all feels good, then great. There's, it's not that you shouldn't be running. But if you're going for a run and you're leaking, or you're going for a run and you just feel like something's not quite right, then again, go and get support, because probably someone can help you get it sorted out, and then you'll be fine. Whereas if you leave it and you keep running, and then your hormones change and you're not doing anything about it, that's when the problems can kick in.
Absolutely. Now, I do have a question that just came to mind, because I'm thinking, for those folks that get epidurals, a lot of the time you aren't necessarily in tune with the force of your pushing when it comes time to push the baby out. Have you found in your work and in working with certain folks that the moms that get epidurals have potentially some poor outcomes with their pelvic floor? Have you seen any correlation between receiving an epidural and stress on the pelvic floor after birth?
I don't know what the stats are around that. I do know that induction has an impact on your pelvic floor. And I know that a longer pushing stage has an impact on your pelvic floor. And epidurals tend to mean a longer pushing stage for exactly the reasons that you just said. So I don't know that, I'm not sure, but I would say that probably there is a bit of a correlation. The other thing is as well that often when people have epidurals, they often don't necessarily birth in such optimal positions. Like, often they're more encouraged to push on their back, which then makes it harder and encourages the pushing stage to be longer. So I really encourage my pregnant clients that if they have an epidural, they try and birth on their side so that there's a bit more space between the sit bones and there's a bit less, the pelvic floor has a bit less sort of in the way. And there's loads you can do in terms of like the position of your pelvis. So when you internally rotate your legs, it creates more space at the outlet of the pelvis. So ideally, if you can be lying on your side with your top leg rotated in, like somebody can sort of, grab it and just turn it in, then that's space, and that's going to help to make it a smoother journey.
Yeah, that's so interesting that you say that. So as a doula, we've done that a ton, even like working with peanut balls and propping the legs and turning them in. I had no idea, though, the actual impact on the pelvic floor in those particular positions, but it definitely makes sense. And so what I'm hearing you say is if moms have inductions, for sure, the stats on that, that maybe because of the medicine and the intensity of the contractions and the longer pushing.
I can't, there was a study and I can't remember all the details of it off the top of my head, but it's something to do with, like you say, the contraction and the pelvic floor response to the contraction is different when you've been induced to when you haven't. And it makes sense when you think about it. But yeah, so it's one of, I mean, as a doula, I'm sure you know that how, it's one of the things that when they talk to you about induction, they don't explain all the risks necessarily. And it's not to say that, you shouldn't be induced. I feel like I did the right thing when I was induced. But they never told me about the fact that it might.
Well, what I'm thinking is like, what I'm hearing is there should be like an action plan, right? So I'm all the way for like curating your postpartum support. And so learning and hearing what you're explaining, the first thing that comes to mind for me is, if my clients are planning an induction or if they somehow have to have one, that having an appointment and having pelvic floor support should basically be automatic.
Yeah, and I mean, to be honest, I would say that for everybody, that postnatal check should be automatic. And again, like there's not a massive difference in terms of whether you birth vaginally and whether you birth via cesarean birth. In terms of the impact on your pelvic floor, like you can, because of the pregnancy and the weight of the baby, and then also the fact that when you have the incision from a cesarean birth, also impacts the pelvic floor. So it's kind of it, without being too negative about it, but however your baby's born, your pelvic floor is impacted. Therefore, and like in some countries, like in France, it's an automatic thing that you get postnatal physio. And that would be kind of the gold standard of care. The gold standard postnatal recovery is to get pelvic floor support afterwards.
I love that. And you're right, it should be for everyone, but I know sometimes folks think that they're okay, if they don't feel anything. And then it's also like, you don't have to be in the worst condition, you don't have to be leaking, you don't have to have all these poor outcomes for you to still kind of get some additional support to make sure that you have optimal pelvic floor health.
Yeah, and I think another thing that's really important, like most of my work now is with mums who are sort of kids are like 3+, possibly have had more than one baby, and were absolutely fine after their first baby. So didn't do anything, didn't really worry about their pelvic floor, went back to their normal exercise, did whatever they, didn't really think about it. Then had another baby, then went back and then was like, oh, something doesn't feel. So it's kind of like, again, what I really try and encourage people to do is to preempt it and just think that birth impacts your pelvic floor. Like, I don't know if this is a US or a UK stat, but 50% of women over 50 have some type of pelvic organ prolapse. And
that's a lot. That's a lot.
Yeah. And I, and like the thing with prolapses, it's almost made too big a deal of, in a way, in terms of that you can have a prolapse and it not be a problem for you at all. Like, so if you're symptom free, it sort of doesn't really matter if you've got a prolapse, but it is useful to know because it will help you to make decisions around, the way that you're doing things, the way that you're exercising, the way that you're living your life, like how much movement you're doing. Because, and another thing is that people can be a bit scared of movement when they've got pelvic floor issues, but actually the best thing you can do is move. Is just not necessarily go for a run, but moving is really, really important, because like any muscle, your pelvic floor needs to be worked. So going for a walk and so on is a good thing for your pelvic floor.
Wow. That was a lot of amazing information. And yeah, I had prolapse after my third birth. And it was so different because I had never experienced it before. I just assumed I was going to bounce back. And then I found myself having to walk up the stairs backwards because I felt like my insides were about to fall out. And I was like, what is this? Like, oh my God. Like, I was like, this is crazy. Like, I guess, and even in my own mind, I just thought, like, you've done it twice.
Yeah.
You're just going to keep this party going. And I just really didn't even as a birth worker, I still didn't even have such a high awareness about pelvic floor health. So I'm really grateful for all the PTs that are out there. And you said women's physio is what you call it in the
women's
UK.
health physios, or pelvic health physios as well.
Okay. So go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and that's my biggest advice. Like, obviously, I really believe in what I do, and the holistic approach to exercise around the pelvic floor. But the first step is to go and see a pelvic health physio, a women's health physio, or pelvic health PT, because then they'll be able to support you through your journey in terms of how, what support you need. Some people don't need an awful lot of support, and some people need more. But like I say, ideally everyone would get that check. So do try and get it if you can.
That's exactly what I was about to ask you. What advice did you give? So you got ahead of it. Thank you for sharing that. Before we go, though, if you could please share with people what you're doing with your organization and how they can reach you.
So I run a company called Centered Mums, which is all about supporting mums during pregnancy, postnatally. And as I say, most of my clients are further along now, and I kind of work a lot on pelvic floor health and general core function. I'm on Instagram at Centered Mums Pilates. My website is centeredmums.com, and I've got loads of free resources on my website. If you go to, there's a thing like on the tabs, it says free downloads, and there's loads of videos and handouts and things that you can download from there that just give you sort of information about pelvic floor health. I have an online program for pelvic floor health as well. And I don't know when this is going out, but I've got a free webinar next week. I run regular webinars about pelvic floor health, and just trying to get as much information out there as possible. So there's loads of information at centeredmums.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us here at Postpartum in the Raw and sharing your story, as well as how you support moms in the UK. And for those of you guys tuning in, I hope that you enjoyed Grace and all of the information that she shared with us. And we will see you next time.
Thank you.